The Constitution, Lecture 6. In this lecture, I'm just going to talk about what we call the Electoral College, the manner of electing the president. This is a strange part of the Constitution. It has never really functioned the way that those who designed it thought it would function. And for that matter, it's a little bit obscure how it was come up with. This was one of those areas where there is a Federalist paper, I believe Federalist 68, where Hamilton gives a kind of defense of it, but we actually don't have many notes from the Constitutional Convention, if I recall right, that explain how this was come up with. But anyways, here's how it works. So remember, members of the House are elected directly by the people they represent. Members of the Senate under the original Constitution are chosen by the legislature of the state that they represent, and that was meant to make them accountable to their state governments. Judges, as we'll see, are appointed. There was a question, how do we choose a president? And the general thinking was that a direct national election was not a good idea, at least in part because I believe the framers did not think that usually there would be any clear majority favored candidate. That people were very much intensely interested in the politics of their own state, and so probably what we would have if you had an open national election is you would have a result where a whole bunch of, like one person was really popular in one state, somebody else was really popular in another state, but there was no candidate like the entire nation came together around. And they were also skeptical of the ability of ordinary citizens to choose for a president somebody who is really genuinely qualified to hold the office. The thinking was you don't necessarily want a popular leader. This is a person who's going to be commander in chief, chief diplomat, chief executive. He exercises a lot of power. He exercises a lot of responsibilities. We want to make sure that people who become president are really qualified to hold this trust. That was their concern. And so they thought, well, what method of choosing the president is actually going to reliably give us candidates that bring those two things together? A genuine consensus candidate whose appeal stretches across multiple states and who is qualified. And I think the Electoral College was how they tried to do this. So here's how it begins. This is Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, I believe. So page 549 at the bottom. It says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. So first of all, notice, each state gets a certain number of electors, that is to say, people who get to cast votes for who the president will be. How many electors does each state get? Well, they get the number of electors equal to their congressional delegation, the number of representatives, plus the number of senators. Now, that formula is important. If each state had a number of electors proportionate to its population, you would have a situation where the smaller states would become irrelevant for purposes of choosing the president. They'd be so small they'd be outvoted. California has like 50 representatives, Wyoming has 1. So if electoral votes were simply distributed on the basis of population, then the large states would be in charge when it comes to choosing the president. But since the U.S. is a federal system made up of states which have their own, kind of integrity as governments, you want to make sure that the federal character of the country, the fact that it's made up of equal states, is incorporated into the choice of the president. And so you do that by adding the number of senators to the number of reps, because every state has an equal number of senators. And so the effect of this formula of number of electors equal to the number of representatives and senators is that it gives a slight boost to the smaller states. So that's how many votes each state gets. The other thing to note is that the people who are electors, the legislature of each state decides how electors are chosen. So the legislature might decide to pick the electors directly, or the legislature of a state might decide to have presidential electors be elected. So people could basically run, like, make me a presidential elector, and whoever got the most votes becomes an elector for the state. So legislatures could directly pick electors, could have votes for electors, could give other parties the power to choose electors. This is an area where, since it's a federal system, it's left up to the states, and according to their judgment, they can choose who those electors will be. But the number is fixed. So, like Wyoming has 3 electors. The Wyoming state legislature gets to choose how a person is chosen to be an elector, but you've got 3 electors. So that's the method of selection. And I believe in a number of states there were elections for electors. So the people didn't vote for president, but they got to choose presidential electors. Then we get to a part of the Constitution that's actually been changed through amendment. This comes on page 550, and it's in the square brackets, where it says, "The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves." Okay, so just a few things here. So first of all, the electors for each state, this is one of the reasons why Electoral College is kind of misleading, is because the electors of the various states do not meet together as one big national assembly. Rather, on an appointed date, the electors for each state meet in their state, right? So like all the electors for California meet together. All the electors from Texas meet together. All the electors from New York meet together. So in each respective state, the electors for each state assemble, and in the original design, they cast 2 votes. They would basically nominate 2 people to be president. And the requirement was one of those people could not be from the same state as the electors. Because the assumption was in each state, electors are going to want to have as president some prominent citizen from their own state, just state pride and the like. And so in order to try to tease out candidates where there might actually be a national consensus behind them to be president, you had to force the electors to look outside of their own state at people from elsewhere to see who might be a good president. And the expectation, I believe, was actually that they expected the out-of-state votes to be the ones that would converge on a common candidate. So each elector would vote for one person from their home state and one other person that they thought was really qualified. And the thinking was probably there'd be a small enough number of really prominent citizens that there would probably be some kind of consensus candidate that would emerge from this process. And then, as they say, they shall make a list of all the persons voted for and of the number of votes for each, which list they shall sign and certify and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. So in other words, they take their votes, like the representatives from Texas, maybe they vote in Austin, they make a list of all the names and how many votes they got, then they officially sign and seal it, and they send it to the Senate in Washington, D.C. And then on an appointed day, the Senate will open up all of the envelopes from each of the states and tally up all of the candidates who got votes and how many votes they got. And then, as it says in the middle of there, the person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. So in other words, you only become president. It's not that if you get the most electoral votes, you're president. You have to actually get a majority of the Electoral College votes to be president. And so that's meant to, that means, you've got to have pretty broad support, right? Because a majority of electors means a majority, sort of represents kind of a majority of the people distributed across a majority of the states. So it's not just enough to have more votes than anybody else. You can imagine an election where there are like 10 candidates, and 8 of them get 10% of the vote, and then another one gets 9% of the vote, and then the final candidate gets 11% of the vote. And if it was simply the case that whoever got the most votes becomes president, then that candidate that received 11% of the electoral votes would become president. But that's kind of an awkward situation to say, here's somebody that was preferred by only 11% of all electors, and yet we're making him president. Surely we need people who have more support than that. So you make it a majority. And then if there is no majority, as it says, if there be more than one who have such majority and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose one of them. So in other words, since you have, each elector casts 2 votes, it is possible for, there to be multiple ones that, basically a majority on the first vote, a majority on the second vote. But anyways, the more relevant thing is if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president, or the representatives of each state vote as a block with just 1 vote. So in other words, if nobody gets an outright majority, then the House of Representatives actually makes the selection from among the top 5 candidates, where each state casts 1 vote for one of the candidates. So it's a very kind of complicated process. But the funny thing is that it really didn't work the way it was envisioned. What I mean by that is that the thinking was electors will be chosen, and then these electors will kind of deliberate and use their own independent judgment to select what they believe to be worthy candidates for president. So the idea was that electors were supposed to exercise independent judgment. They're supposed to really, the whole point of choosing them as electors is you want them to make a good quality decision and to deliberate. But of course, in the first 2 elections, there was really nothing to deliberate about because, as long as George Washington was willing to be president, he was going to be chosen as president. He was such a prominent citizen. So the Electoral College in the first 2 presidential elections was pretty much just a rubber stamp for George Washington. And then by the time you get to 1796, when Adams is elected, by 1796, the political parties have emerged. You have the Jeffersonian Democrats and you have the Federalists, and they're opposed parties. And so at that point, what usually ends up happening is, like if you have a state legislature that is dominated by Jeffersonians, then they're going to pick for their electors in that state people that they know will vote for Jefferson. So in other words, the selection of electors became a matter of partisan loyalty. So again, in that case, electors still are not really exercising independent judgment. They are chosen because everybody knows that guy's going to vote for that guy's going to vote for a Federalist for president. This guy's going to vote for a Democrat for president. So instead of independence, at that point, the electors become rubber stamps for the parties. They vote for the candidate that represents their party. So first they're rubber stamps for George Washington, then they become rubber stamps for the parties, and that's the way they've remained ever since. So you could say the way it works is this, because somebody might be confused. They might say, hey, I've gone to vote, and when I went to vote, I, voted, for Donald Trump, or I voted for Hillary Clinton. And the ballot said Trump, Clinton, and you filled in one of the bubbles. And you might say, that sure looks like I'm voting directly for president, but you're telling me that actually it's the electors who choose for the president. So what am I doing when I'm casting a vote for president? Right? If my vote doesn't count, what am I doing? Well, here's how it works. In most states, the way they work it out is this. So let's just pick Texas. So Texas will pick, I don't know, how many, does Texas have 38 representatives? I can't remember. Let's just pretend Texas has 38 representatives. So the Texas State Republican Party will pick 38 people as their slate of electors. So here are the 38 Republican electors. And the Democratic Party will pick 38 Democratic electors for president. And then the rules at the state level are basically this. Whichever presidential candidate gets the most votes, that candidate's party's electors become the electors for our state. So for example, the state Republican Party, the Texas Republican Party picks 38 people to be electors. The Democratic Party picks 38 people to be the Democratic electors. And, 2016, Trump wins. So what that means is those 38 Republican electors now become officially the people who get to cast electoral votes on behalf of the state of Texas. So in other words, the Electoral College is basically a partisan rubber stamp. whichever party gets the most votes for presidents at the state level, that party's electors become the electors for that state. So that's the way it works today. And that's so, it's kind of funny. The Electoral College, it never really did what it was envisioned to do, namely exercise independent judgment in the choice of president. So there's just one other thing I have to say about the choice of president, and that's the 12th Amendment, because the presidential elections have been changed somewhat. In the original rules, the rule was whoever came in second for president became vice president. I mean, this is simplifying a little bit, but that's the basic rule. And that made sense, right? At the Constitutional Convention, it made sense. So you want to have a vice president because you need somebody who can step into the office of president should the president die or become incapacitated. And that person who steps into office, you want that to be somebody that's generally approved of as being worthy of that office. And so what better way to do that than by saying, okay, the person who gets the majority of Electoral College votes, that person becomes president. And whoever came in second, so in other words, the one that was the second best choice, that person can be vice president. That way, if the president dies or incapacitated, he's replaced by the runner-up for president, which makes sense. There are lots of times where the runner-up will replace the person in first. But the development of political parties messed that up because, again, by 1796, you have two rival parties, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans or Jeffersonian Democrats. And so what happened in 1796 then is you had an election and John Adams won and Thomas Jefferson came in second. The problem, of course, is that Adams and Jefferson were kind of bitter political enemies at this point. So instead of the president and the vice president having a good relationship, they had a horrible relationship. And the person who was vice president was actually in many ways openly opposed to the policy of the president because Jefferson was the leader of the rival party to the president's party. So this whole rule about somebody coming in, the person who comes in second being vice president, that might make sense if you have a system where there are no political parties and where partisanship is not an issue and all candidates are taken on individual merit. But that system exists precisely nowhere. And so in pretty much electoral democracies inevitably develop political parties. And then once you have political parties, then this idea that the person who comes in second should be runner-up wouldn't make sense. So for example, if this had never been amended, then when Trump was elected, the vice president would have been Hillary Clinton. Right? You can see how awkward that would be. So the 12th Amendment changed that. So according to the 12th Amendment, and there was some shenanigans in the 1800 election, which we don't need to get into, involving Aaron Burr. But basically what the 12th Amendment did is it revised things so that electors, instead of casting 2 votes for president, electors would cast 1 vote for a presidential candidate and 1 vote for a vice presidential candidate. So you have a separate vote for vice president. And the president and the vice president can't come from the same state. That's how you still have that requirement about 1 vote being for somebody from out of state. So now that's why the vice president is separately elected, and that's why presidential candidates nowadays run on a ticket where there's the president and they choose a vice presidential candidate to run with them. And so then the electors then cast a partisan vote for their party's presidential candidate and their party's vice presidential candidate. So that's how the president is chosen. In the next lecture, we're going to move on to Article 3, which covers the federal judiciary, the judicial branch.